So it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel. We have Paul Flynn, the Managing Director and CEO of Whitehaven Coal, Sanjeev Paul, former Vice President of Safety, Health, and Sustainability of Tata Steel, and Jesse Gary, President and CEO of Century Aluminum. The moderator for our panel today is Kelvin Henry, reporter at NBC San Diego.
Good morning, everyone. So as you know, we are here for the Mining and Metals panel. If we could begin by having everyone introduce themselves, if we could start.
As Sean said, I'm Jesse Gary. I'm the president and CEO of Century Aluminum. We're about a $3 billion NASDAQ-listed aluminum company producing bauxite, alumina, and aluminum globally in Iceland, Jamaica, and we're the largest producer of aluminum in the United States.
Morning, everyone. I'm Paul Flynn, Managing Director and CEO of Whitehaven Coal. We're a thermal coal and metallurgical coal producer in Australia, the largest Australian listed player in that space. We export completely the entirety of our output into Asia, and so very much linked into the supply chains for our Asian neighbours. The company has grown significantly over the years and now is predominantly a metallurgical coal producer. Approximately about 40 million tonnes in total per annum. I've been leading the company now for 11 years.
Good morning. I'm Sanjeev Paul. I work with Tata Steel, which is the flagship company of Group Tata. I have led some of the subsidiaries like Tata Metallics and a company called JUSCO, which is a utility-based company. But I superannuated as the Vice President of Tata Steel's Safety, Health, and Sustainability division. Steel is a hard-to-abate industry and a very important player if the world has to reach net zero. And sustainability happens to be one of the key aspects of what Tata Steel wanted to do. I had the privilege of handling that role till I retired a year and a half ago. Thank you.
And we can begin with, of course, the energy transition is a major topic right now. If we could go down the line, if you could tell us what raw material requirements are necessary for the energy transition.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this as walking up here. In a way, we should probably be going last today because we're about to hear about all the different transition innovations that are coming. And once you all tell us what those need to be, we'll tell you what the materials are necessary to make that happen. We've had a lot of different types of transitions to come. And the truth is, in this country, we really haven't seen much demand growth on the energy side for a number of years. And we're starting to transition there. But when you look at what we know, and maybe we'll just start by focusing on a few things that Sean mentioned. When you look at solar, maybe when you look at EVs, and you look at distributed energy in general, you start to see and can start to calculate just how much more material intensive these industries are than the traditional gas turbine or coal power station. For instance, a solar field in general per megawatt is about 20% more energy intensive than a combined gas unit. Not energy intensive, material intensive than a combined gas turbine. When you start to think about, maybe just to take aluminum specifically, and maybe, as Dean Garrett mentioned, looking at China specifically, when you look at demand growth just in 2024 alone in aluminum in the energy transition space, you've had 20% increase in aluminum demand in China in 2024 just in the solar industry. You've had 40% aluminum demand increase just in China for EVs. And you've had another 20% increase year over year in China just for energy distribution. And so these areas are significantly more energy intensive, material intensive, and really drive the need for these materials generally. Now that's aluminum. These two gentlemen will talk about some other materials, but you also go into more mining intensive sectors, lithium, copper, whatever it may be. All of these materials are necessary and able to in order to enable the transition.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. I think one Well, I think it's, as you say, it's all of the above, I think, is required here. And there's not too many minerals that are currently being mined that the world doesn't need more of. And that in itself is a challenge, just because the practical delivery of the scaling up of the mining effort required. In our instance, in the context of coal, we sell the best thermal coal in the world. When I say the best, in the seaborne trade, it's the lowest emissions per tonne of coal consumed for power generation. And so Whitehaven's thermal product is by far the lowest emissions outcome you can derive from generating electricity with a thermal coal product. Now that enables the transition for our various customer countries with their various commitments under, as Dean Garrett said, COP29. They've all got commitments for transition. As everybody knows, it's not a switch that you flick. One day you have emissions, the next day you don't. There's obviously the transition requires a tapering over time and the replacement of other technologies that can drive your energy needs in an affordable and secure way, hopefully. The other side of our business is metallurgical coal, and metallurgical coal is fundamental for everything steel related, and will be for a long time to come. And we also know that there are emissions reduction efforts in steel making, and Sanjeev can speak to that, no doubt. But for the foreseeable future, you're going to need metallurgical coal to produce everything related to, in this context, the transition infrastructure we requires steel, and metallurgical coal will be required for that. The outlook looks very good from that perspective, but again, we see projections of seaborne trade requiring an extra, in the next 15 years, another, in rough numbers, about 75 million tonnes of metallurgical coal production over and above what the world achieves today. And in order to achieve that, you're going to have significant improvements in the exploration, significant improvements in the regulation, the approvability of projects, the elongation of the approval timelines for developing a new mine have extended considerably. So meeting these timelines is a significant challenge. So 15 years, as I mentioned, for another 75 million tonnes. It takes on average about 15 years to actually develop a new mine from scratch, from exploration through to first product. And so you can all do the math there. That doesn't really work if you need another 75 million tonnes in 15 years' time, but it takes 15 years to get a mine approved from exploration through to first product. So there's a massive disconnect here which needs to be addressed, which is something I think the whole world is wrestling with, and obviously a subject matter of this important conversation today.
I'll say ditto to what Jesse and Paul have said. From a steel standpoint, I'll just add one. See, today, around 1.8 to 1.9 billion tons of steel is manufactured across the world, 70% of which is manufactured through the blast furnace basic oxygen furnace route, which utilizes the metallurgical coke that Paul was just speaking of. Going forward, the research with various think tanks, including the International Energy Agency, says that this quantum, this percentage, will fall down from 70 to 30%. The blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace route emits 2.5 tons of carbon on an average per ton of crude steel, which is very high. The more carbon efficient routes which are available as of now, which is the electric arc furnace, the directly reduced iron, they produce around 0.4 to 1.5 tons of carbon dioxide, so slightly more efficient. So this would be one change that I feel, and maybe the metallurgical coal industry might not be approve of too much, but this is how the world will move and transition towards a more sustainable paradigm. I think less of steel will be produced via this route than the other ones.
And this question would be for you, Sanjeev. What are the energy requirements to bring these materials online, specifically for steel?
What are the energy requirements? See, as I said earlier, metallurgical coal is the mainstay today for manufacturing of steel. So that is one primary source. But as we move forward towards a more sustainable paradigm, the materials, the energy required will be more liquefied gas, which has a lower carbon footprint, and the DRI route of manufacturing steel. Green hydrogen, which will be produced with green electricity, will come in. You'll enrich this gas with green hydrogen to make it further more efficient. And you will require to do CCUS, carbon capture and use, or carbon capture and storage, to make sure that you have near zero manufacturing production facilities.
And for Jesse, I would like to ask you, what are the implications of North American manufacturing onshoring in your particular industry?
Yeah, and I think Dean Garrett alluded to this a little bit, but we have seen a significant change in the way trade is working around the world over the past 5 to 10 years. And you've seen for the first time in this country real industrial policy focused on reshoring into the U.S., domestic manufacturing, but also metals and mining. And the Inflation Reduction Act was a big part of that. But maybe just to step back for a second, why is that even necessary? And what we saw in metals and mining for sure is coming out of the last super cycle, which led up to the financial crisis in 2008, you saw a significant glut of materials around the world. And it's really taken those last 15 years or so for that glut to be worked through. Certainly in aluminum, where we've gone from over 2 years worth of supply down to 7 weeks supply today. And what that's meant is that in our industries, there hasn't been a lot of excitement to invest. Most of the investment in metals and mining over this period has come in China, and ours, basically all in the aluminum industry, has come in China. And for the first time, as nation states start to look at domestic supply chains and put in place industrial policy, we're starting to get programs that are enabling domestic investment again to bring supply back online. And it's really necessary. So just to use aluminum as an example, in the US, you have about a 6 million ton market for aluminum a year. We can only produce 700,000 tons ourselves. Our neighbors to the north in Canada can produce about 3 million tons, but you're still left with a market that's almost 3 million tons short for aluminum. And you really only need to look back to World War II, where the US doubled the size of its aluminum industry going into the war to see just how necessary it is to have these supply chains put in place. And when you put it all together, and Dean Garrett mentioned the EV tariffs coming into the US, so what that means is you want to have your own EV industry here in the US. Well, an EV uses about 400 pounds more aluminum per vehicle than an internal combustion engine vehicle. So for every vehicle that you switch from internal combustion to EV, you need 400 pounds more aluminum, but we can't produce enough to even meet our current demands here in the US. So as we look to these policies, as we want to bring jobs and manufacturing jobs back to the US, you really do need to pair it with industrial policy to enable the investment to come again. And that's what we're starting to see. And I'll talk about it in a minute here, but we've recently announced that we're going to build the first new smelter in the US since 1980. Also happens to be the year I was born. So it's been a long, long time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second.
And for Sanjeev, if you could tell us, what are the implications of North American manufacturing for your industry?
See, as the world transitions to a more sustainable steelmaking, there are a few changes that will happen globally, which will impact various supply chains. One is, as I said earlier, that the mainstay of the manufacturing process, which has been the mainstay for hundreds of years, which is the blast furnace route, which is the countercurrent process, that will come down. So the requirement of coal, metallurgical coking coal, is coming down. But what will happen is that areas and geographies where there is enough gas available, which produces lower carbon footprint for steel manufacturing, those will flourish and those will become steelmaking regions again. US happens to be one of them. Secondly, regions which have a high amount of steel embedded in their economy, which will come back for recycling. For example, US has around 12 to 13 tons per capita of steel embedded in its economy, which will come down as scrap for remelting. So most of the developed world has this kind of high steel embedded in the economy. So the US will become, US is already going for secondary steel making. In the last 10 years, you'll notice the steel manufacturing capacity in the US has increased from 40 to 90 million tons again. So it's going back. So these are the two major changes that you will see for onshore manufacturing in the United States.
And for Paul, where do you see the demand for metallurgical coal going as a part of the energy transition?
Well, it's at the risk of contradicting Sanjeev there. I think I'm just in the, well, we're in the practical business of delivering.
I'm an ally, by the way.
The notion of metallurgical coal demand diminishing, I would contest that idea. That's certainly not the experience that we are seeing in terms of from our customer base. But the challenge here is just, I think we just need to step back a little bit, as Jesse said, and just look at not just the headline statements in terms of what it is we aspirationally want to achieve, but what actually we can do from a practical reality of delivering. And that is the challenge that our business is confronting in terms of how do we facilitate this change. As Sanjeev's mentioned, and Dean Garrett mentioned also, the focus is on innovation. And so there's no doubt that electric arc furnaces and direct reduction technology will be part of the future. No doubt about that at all. But you have to have cheap energy in order to have electric arc furnace function in a profitable manner. And direct reduction technology also, and you need a different quality iron ore in order to make that work as well, which is not common around the world. So I just want to call out a couple of practical difficulties in all this. If you don't have cheap electricity, ERF and these technologies don't work. And you are unique here in this country in having cheap electricity for the most part across. I mean, it's quite state-based, but for the most part you have affordable electricity by virtue of your oil and gas production here domestically. Most other countries don't have that, and that is an important point to make here. So what we talk about conceptually being possible here in the future with the development of these innovations is not translatable at the same velocity across other jurisdictions because they don't have the endowment of natural resources that you are blessed with in this jurisdiction in particular. We have plenty of gas in my country, in Australia, and we export heavily into Asia, so we understand this game well. But that is not cheap gas. It's not like gas that you have here. It's not cheap in relative terms to what Jesse, you need for aluminium smelting, being one of the most energy-intensive industrial processes in the world. And in fact, one of them, which closely behind you, is essentially the conversion of sand into polysilicate. That to make solar panels, that is also one of the most energy-intensive activities, industrial activities in the world. And so in order to do these things, you need cheap energy. So your policies that give rise to higher energy costs for this purpose are counterproductive to the objectives that we have in terms of lowering our emissions into the future. So for metallurgical coal, from our perspective, certainly customer demand is very good. The transition, as we say, to electric arc furnaces or direct reduction, that is certainly decades ahead of the curve here. And so our customers are very much focused on making steel. They make steel today with the technologies they have today. That doesn't mean they're not focused on the technologies of tomorrow. They are very much so. And they should continue to invest in that. But today, the pathway for metallurgical coal demand, as I said, is about 75 million tonnes on the seaborne trade. It's about 400 million today, so it's about 75 million tonnes more required in the next 15 years. And so our customers are very concerned about the paucity of supply in the metallurgical coal market. And in our instance, we recently bought a couple of mines from BHP, metallurgical coal mines, and that happened on the 2nd of April. And we recently just announced the formation of a joint venture on the larger asset because with two Japanese tier 1 steelmakers. Now, why did they do that? So they wanted to buy equity in the project to secure the offtake for the long term. Now, the mine that they bought in has been operating for 50 years and has over 100 years of coal remaining in it. And so why did they do that? It's because they feel insecure about the continued supply of this valuable product to make the steel the world needs. And so not only do they feel anxious about it, but they paid us over a 50-cent premium in a matter of months over what we paid for it. And so that's quite an extraordinary thing to see. Now, they're not in the business of doing that for no apparent reason. They're doing it because there is heightened concern about not just will we be able to produce the 75 million tonnes over and above that is forecast to be required in the seaborne market. It's about the continuity of the supply they experience today in order to deliver the outcomes they need to deliver today. And so that to us is very much an affirmation of the trajectory we see in terms of the metallurgical coal demand in order to deliver the transition. As I say, all the infrastructure you require for the transition requires steel, all of it. And so without steel, you have no transition. And of course, without cheap energy, you have no transition. So I think we just need to come back to some of the basics here rather than focusing on necessarily the aspirations are well understood and worthy. I think the challenge here is not that. That's not to question that. It's just about what can we do in the timeframes that are reasonable to deliver for the world. And I think we're all aligned to the outcome. It's just about the time.
And maybe just to circle back to the first question a little bit and to build on Paul's point, that we really need all of the above. It's very true. All of these applications are much more material intensive than what we had before. Again, just to go back to the combined cycle gas turbine versus a solar field, a combined cycle gas turbine is built on maybe 100, 200 acres of land. You've got a gigawatt of energy coming from one source. To produce a gigawatt of solar, you're spread over 1,000 acres at least, probably more like 5,000, 6,000 acres, some of the solar guys can tell us, and you're running aluminum cables between them to distribute that energy, and you've got silicon into the panels, and you've got a much more material intensive per megawatt outcome. And what that means is you're going to need two things. You're going to need all of the existing material capacity that's out there. And then we've had basically 20 years where no one has built new material production around the globe. And you're going to, in order to get people to build again, to build new copper mines, to build new steel mills, to build new aluminum smelters, you're going to need this price response from the market. And that's really what we've been waiting for over the last 5 years here, is as the energy transition has become more clear and we can see the materials that are started to be needed, we're waiting for those price indications to drive the investment response on the supply side. We haven't really seen that yet. It's only just starting to come. And really only, to Paul's point again about the US being different, only in those places where you have a real industrial policy that's sort of incentivizing the supply response to come on. If instead we look across the Atlantic to Europe, in my space in particular, you've continued to see aluminum smelters shut down rather than be built. And that's the exact opposite response of what we need. And why has that happened? They've had higher energy prices. They've been pushing a regulatory scheme from the CO2 side that requires a lot of investment to be made, but there's no support for that investment to be made. So this is a really complicated response from our industry in order to meet these demands. And the truth is we will need everything that exists today and then some. And so we have to come up with a policy from these various nation states that enable those investments to be made and the returns to be given to our shareholders.
And both Paul and Jesse, I would like to follow up with you guys. You touched on it, but if you could expand a little more on how are government policies affecting that production?
I might just follow your comments there, Jesse, because you are fortunate in this country in having the, albeit peculiarly named Inflation Reduction Act, in terms of what it does. We don't have the equivalent. And
inflation is back down again.
No, well, we have inflation, so there's a common point there. There's a common point there. It's stickier in our country. It's stickier in our country than it appears to be here, but we certainly have that. But we don't actually have a focus on reindustrialization of the economy, which is a challenge. We have a headline policy which speaks to, made in Australia, but one of the critical ingredients for that, as we've mentioned, is you need affordable energy to reindustrialise our nation. And we are in an unusual situation where we have an abundance of pretty much any raw material you want and everything required for the transition, pretty much we have in Australia. So we're in a very fortunate position in that regard. But as Dean Garrett mentioned earlier, China has put its foot very much firmly on the processing of all these important minerals, the processing capacity, not necessarily the mining of it, the processing of capacity of these important minerals for the transition. They dominate. And so if you want to compete with that, you do need to have affordable energy policy. So if you want to reindustrialise your economy rather than just being, for want of a better term, the sandpit that you dig up the stuff and send it to someone else, if you want to go down the value chain and create and retain some of the value of the beneficiation of those raw materials for your own country, then you are going to need more affordable energy. And it's peculiar again in this instance, and we were talking last night about the relative energy costs. Our energy costs in Australia are 2 to 3 times what you'll experience here. And so how are you going to reindustrialise your economy if you have an impost in one of the key inputs to manufacture of what are very, very energy-intensive processes, and then compete with the US or whoever it might be? Okay, we have a freight advantage in terms of being more proximate to the points of consumption in Asia than other places do. So there's definitely an advantage there that we have, but you're starting well behind the 8 ball if you have energy costs that are 2 to 3 times your primary competitors. And so that is definitely a challenge for us. So in our country, we need to deal with that. But we are blessed with an abundance of all the resources that you need for this space. And we have a world-class mining industry to deliver that. But if you want to retain some of that additional value for your citizens of the upstream beneficiation and improvement value-adding aspects of the processing of these materials, then you need cheap energy.
Would you like to weigh in on that?
No, I agree with Paul in general. And just to bring it back to the U.S. briefly, we are very lucky to have this energy markets that we have, which enables us to reindustrialize this country. And I think, again, on the energy side, we'll have a bit of all of the above. So, we know the energy transition is underway here. We're absolutely behind in some aspects from what's gone on in China in terms of solar penetration, in terms of EV penetration, and all those things. But we can clearly see them coming in this country today. And I think the second order implications of that start to be, as you have put in place some policies in order to enable that reindustrialization to take place. So I look at the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's paired with some of the 301 tariffs on China or the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. These policies actually work together to allow the reindustrialization and investment to be made. But as Dean Garrett mentioned, if you then allow investment into Mexico from certain of these countries that you're trying to move away from a supply chain perspective, you have to have a complete policy so that you don't see the reindustrialization that is targeted for the U.S. instead move across the southern border into Mexico, seeking cheap labor, just as we saw 20 years ago the industrialization of the U.S. Move out into Southeast Asia. So these are very complicated policy requirements in order to enable what is a very clear goal of an energy transition to take place.
And to build on that for you, Jesse, Century Aluminum is going to be building its first U.S. smelter since 1980. Now, tell us about how the energy transition is playing into that opportunity for your company.
Yeah. I mean, we've mentioned a little bit just how much more material intensive the energy transition is for aluminum specifically, and just how short the market is here. But maybe another way to look at it is when you look at where the aluminum supply has come on over the past 20 years. In the US, we've gone from 30 aluminum smelters down to 4 today over that time period. In China, they've gone from 5% of the world supply to 60% of the world supply over that period. And so you've had this massive reorientation of where production exists in the world. But when you look in terms of our goals on the greenhouse gas side, what you've also seen is in China, you get about 18 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminum produced. Our new smelter that we'll build here in the US will be below 4. And so these locations of these industrial assets matter, and they matter to where, again, your overall policy and the world that we wish to live in exists. And a lot of that goes back to energy sources. A lot of that goes to the technology that we use to reduce the alumina into aluminum. But all of this matters. And so what I just want to sort of keep going back to is, as we think about the energy transition, which in large part is both government-driven transition, but also a market-driven transition, we have to think about all aspects and keep all of this working together. The energy transition will move us to lower CO2 sources of energy over time, which will enable us to produce materials with lower CO2 footprint overall per ton. But we need the materials to enable the lower CO2 energy sources to be built. And so all of this needs to be sequenced correctly. The market will do most of that, but we also need to be careful in having consistent regulatory environments, consistent trade policy, consistent industrial policy, because a lot of these investments are very large, billions of dollars, and a lot of them take, as Paul said, 10 to 15 years to build a new copper mine. I mean, this is very long-term investments to be made.
And for Paul, what is the current state of carbon capture and sequestration and additional pathways for your sector to reach net neutrality?
Yeah, look, that's definitely an interesting topic, and one I'm sure you could have a whole conference on in and of itself. Carbon capture and storage is familiar to people in the US to an extent, because you obviously have in your existing gas fields, you use obviously CO2 injection for enhanced oil recovery. So that's something which you understand conceptually, whereas again, that's not an experience which is shared across the world. And so this is another one of the challenges in terms of how we roll out these technologies. Whilst the US may be accustomed to injection of CO2 and its retention underground, in the pursuit of further oil from declining oil fields, that experience is not shared in our country and many others at all. And so there's lots of resistance to the notion of storing CO2 underground, and obviously that's a challenge for everybody. But despite that, the IEA has repeatedly cited CCS as being critical to the pursuit of our net zero ambitions, and quite frankly, without it, we're not going to get there. I mean, the emissions reduction technologies absent CCS will get you partway there, but unless you're actually going to capture and sequester the CO2 underground, you are not going to be able to achieve that. Now, in our instance in Australia, uniquely, we have all the producers of coal voluntarily contribute to a fund on a per tonne tariff basis that we contribute into a technology fund, and we've been pursuing CCS quite uniquely because it's just a voluntary initiative. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars doing this, exploring the geography in Australia, looking for various places where CCS would be prospective. And I'm sure for everybody here, you'll understand that in order for CCS to be useful, you, like the steel industry and scrap industry, you need to actually have an industry that actually supports CCS. So it's not just where the point of generation of the emissions, but you actually have to have an economically viable location in a relatively short distance, to be able to store your CO2. So the point of generation of the emission might be at your power station, say, for instance, but you could say that the reservoir where you can inject and retain the CO2 might be hundreds of kilometres away. And so the challenge of this industry is actually building an industry to support that. So you need to capture it, then presumably liquefy it, transport it, in whatever form, whether that be trucks, which would be inefficient, but pipeline better, then to a field where CO2 can be stored. And so that is generally the challenge of it. The capturing of CO2, I think people understand, and at least in coal-fired generation, it's the capture of the CO2 is actually relatively simple, much easier than in steelmaking. Steelmaking, the point of emissions in steelmaking are much more diverse and harder to control and therefore capture the CO2 than coal-fired power station capture of CO2 is. So that is a challenge. So it is critical to the pathway forward, but there are lots of areas where we need to invest further in order to do that. A price of carbon will help in some areas, so there's no doubt about that, because that creates a market. And as much as we started out the conference saying that policy doesn't generally drive this, you need the right supportive framework in order to actually to allow the innovation to flourish in a way that will progress this particular industry moving forward. But there are about 300, between 300 and 400 projects of CCS around the globe. Europe is actually making quite good progress in this area in particular, which is good. They need to, but each of those projects are relatively small in reservoir capacity. And when I say reservoir, how much storage of CO2 you can inject into the ground retain. I think the future of that will be, as the oil and gas people will understand very well, we might hear later on today, obviously exhausted oil reservoirs and gas reservoirs will be obviously viable places for storage over time. And I think that will be a point of competitive advantage, I think, over time, where you have actually these depleted reservoirs available to be used for this purpose.
And as we know, artificial intelligence is a major topic for every industry. So I'd like to open this up to everyone on the panel.
Kelvin,
there.
before you move to artificial, may I just weigh in on some of the discussions that we have just had? Specifically with the reality of business and the reality of the world with respect to low-cost energy. Whilst the reality has been expressed very well by Paul and Jesse, there is an ambition. Fact is that we are today already at around 418 ppm of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And climate scientists say that if we do not stabilize this concentration of carbon dioxide by around 450 ppm, we can kiss away a 2 degree centigrade world going forward. The amount of emission, carbon emission coming out into the atmosphere every year has been increasing. And again, scientists believe that the budget left to reach that 450 ppm will be exhausted by 2030. Today, steel is just 7 to 8% of the total emissions of the 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions that happen. We are just 7 to 8%. But the denominator is reducing. With power having found answers to decarbonization, with short distance mobility having found answers to decarbonization, and this account for around 45% of the emissions. And in the next 1.5 to 2 decades, this will move away from the denominator. And very soon we'll be a significant 35 to 40% of emissions if nothing happens on the processes for decarbonizing the steel industry. Steel is considered to be a hard to abate sector. So there is an ambition on what is required to be done to move to a more sustainable paradigm. And that is why there was a pathway which, in fact, we supported, we helped IEA develop that pathway, and that pathway was shown. But I do take Paul's point that it will be easier said than done. There are plenty of, and from an Indian standpoint, I'm telling you, China today produces around half the steel of the world, primarily through the blast furnace POF route, which is the less efficient way of doing it. In the next 25 years, they are projected to be coming down from that 50% production of global capacity to 25%, to around 450 odd million tons of production every year. And all of that will be without the blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace route. Very little coming from there. India, on the other hand, which produces just 100 million tons, 7 or 8% of the total steel capacity, will move in the next 25, 30 years to 450 million tons. Most of it will be supporting you, Paul, because we are setting up the blast furnaces, because there is no other cheap source of energy available. The near zero technologies are all far too distant and require low cost energy. Hydrogen is today at $6 a kg. Unless it comes down to $1.5 to $2 a kg, you can't make steel profitably out of it. So these are the, Jesse has been talking of how complicated this entire game is. And this is what I thought I'll just put forth, the difficulty, the paradox of how you want to do certain things going forward, and time is of the essence, yet you don't really have all the answers.
I might just add to Sanjeev, because he made a good point here, is the practical side of this is really quite, it's difficult to comprehend the scale of the effort required to meet these objectives, because as you just heard Sanjeev's outlook in terms of the steel production aspirations for India are enormous, and India definitely has real momentum in this drive, which is great. But I think it just comes back to, if I could bring it back to just the mining side of things just for a moment, just for a second. And the reason I wanted to do that, just because, again, part of the considerations we need to have in this transition is just, again, the practical reality of delivering. Now, mining in our country is a very big piece of the economy. We understand mining very well. But the scale of mining required to deliver the transition materials is enormous. And some estimates say the footprint of mining is about 4 times what we currently have today as the footprint. When I say the footprint, the surface area covered by mining. Now, Jesse's made some terrific points about the land required for generating diffuse forms of energy. That is extraordinary. I think the future of energy generally is not about diffuse forms. The future of energy would be more about concentrated forms and using the minimum footprint required to produce the densest energy, nuclear being obviously one obvious answer to that question. But in the scale of mining, not just whether it be coal or iron ore or whatever you like, the scale is quite large. And then when you transition to, we haven't talked much about critical minerals, and people have various different minerals in terms of what they put in that basket of what people generally refer to as critical minerals. The mining of those types of minerals is also important to consider as well, because the scale of mining is just as large, but the outcome is actually tiny. And in terms of the mineral required for these particular inputs to manufacture. And so that's the challenge of this and all these critical minerals industries today are very small. Like they're very small in relative terms, in terms of the scale of the industry, whether it be rare earths or battery metals more generally, that's very, very small. But to scale that up is going to be an enormous job, because you're not chasing 1% of the material. Say if you're the ore, now everybody understands mining, you've got a lot of dirt you've got to remove before you get to the ore bearing the mineral you're after. And in history gone by, you might be chasing something of 2-3% of material. Copper, they'd love to have that sort of grade if that was possible. No longer, less than 1% is generally the average of the grade of new copper mines in the world. And so, and critical minerals are actually even smaller than that. They're 0.0 something. And so the scale of mining required to deliver the outcomes you need here, again, needs to be thought through. And the reason why I'm raising it is just because it's not just a financing issue, or it's not just a regulatory issue to try and speed up that 15-year average period that I was referring to before. It's actually quite a large societal issue as well, because the footprint of mining, if we're going to chase this transition down hard, and we're diverging away, as everybody understands, and as you point out, Sanjeev, we need to do something different if we're going to close that gap. But the scale of mining required in order to do that is quite extraordinary, and I think society needs to think through that and plan for it well if we are going to be able to accommodate the footprint of the scale of mining required in order to generate these important materials to deliver that future. So I think it was useful just to make that point, I think.
Absolutely. Well, as I was mentioning before, artificial intelligence is something that everyone is talking about these days. So if you can tell us, how has or will artificial intelligence impact the mining and metals industry?
Yeah, maybe just to start briefly on this, it's a two-part answer. One is, how will it affect our ability in the way we run our companies? And then two, what we've started to see, and certainly in the headlines in this country over the past 6 months here, is the vast energy demand that will be required in order to build these AI data centers that the hyperscalers are starting to do. And again, we started talking in the beginning about how we have not really seen much load growth in this country over the past 10 years. Well, we're about to see that change very significantly. And I'm sure everyone in this room has seen these projections, which are anywhere from amazing to unbelievable in terms of how much load growth is actually going to come. And that has implications for the rest of industry, because when you start to look at some of these deals that have been announced, you see a lot less price sensitivity to energy than maybe a lot of other industries have in terms of what these data centers are willing to pay. And that, of course, has implications in terms of which energy resources are brought back online in order to serve these AI data centers. I don't think anyone ever thought 3 Mile Island would restart, and yet here we are. It is coming back online. And so this has broad implications from the energy side of things, which is important to our businesses. But it also has very exciting implications in terms of what it can enable and unlock in metals and mining as well. We, like anyone else, always strive for efficiencies. We always strive for ways to produce the metals that we produce or the minerals that we produce in more economic ways. And I think we can clearly see both through machine learning, but also through really AI itself, how this can drive down our cost of production over time. So we're both excited and scared by what is to come.
Paul.
Yeah, Kelvin, I think Jesse says as a competing consumer on the grid for the available electricity. I mean, it's like you say, they're eye-watering projections, and they're talking in terms of thousands of megawatts here. You know, at each particular, company is talking about thousands of megawatts, and that's not easily solved because, as you say, the surface area required if you want to go the renewable way of things, to provide thousands of megawatts of capacity, and obviously a data center is not going to be very functional if it's intermittent in its operation. So it will need baseload power or intermittent sources with backup. And so that's a big ask in that sense. But it does, as you say, drives up the price for everybody else because you've got these new consumers on the grid drawing heavily on the grid. And so that stimulates obviously new investment, hopefully in terms of grid capacity coming on, but it's certainly lifting the price of wholesale electricity dramatically. And so I think that's fascinating in the sense, and that says to me is that, come back to what I said earlier, it's all of the above. Everything that's currently installed today needs to stay and last for longer. I think that's 3 Mile Island is a good example. In our country, all the coal-fired power stations in our country have to be maintained in a way that's going to make them last a lot longer than what people expected. And that is quite a big shift from where we've been in more recent times. The narrative in our country has been, we won't need you by a certain date. And so that might be, we've got 25% of the state that I live in, power is generated by one power station, coal-fired power station, and it was supposed to close next year. And that clearly couldn't happen because we don't have a replacement for 25% of the grid capacity. And so the government, at the last minute, unfortunately, gave them a 2-year extension. Now, we know what's going to happen again. In 2 years' time, they're going to get another extension and then another extension. And unfortunately, this is not particularly insightful in terms of long-term planning, but that is the political environment we're in. And so that's challenging. So everything is going to have to be made to last longer. Now, I might just flip over, if I could, to the side that Jesse mentioned, just in terms of about AI and its impact on our operations of our mines. And so we have a fully autonomous mine, which is fascinating to see. So there's no drivers in the trucks removing the overburden or the coal, and that's quite extraordinary. We've been at this developing in another mine, but we've recently bought one with it which fully implemented, and I think that will be the way of the future in terms of how we go. So it doesn't mean less employment. It actually means different employment, and you can see less people in trucks, but actually more people in other roles facilitating the autonomous operation of a mine. And I think this is just the beginning of that journey, because you're going to see it extend into drilling, say for instance, for sure is going to be part of that. You'll see water cuts, you'll see graders, you'll see dozers. I think excavator operators will still probably have humans in them for some foreseeable future, but you can see the opportunity to offer employment in our industry across a whole range of different skills, whether they be, computer scientists who are actually going to help us deliver and modify and refine and improve that technology over time. You can just see a whole range of different roles coming in our business that is going to hopefully make it more attractive, because as much as it might be surprising for you all to hear, I mean, young people coming out of school aren't necessarily attracted to the idea of mining the way they were in the past. Now that there are lots of other opportunities for young people these days, and so we've got to do something as an industry in order to actually incentivise people to be interested again in a career in mining, because, as I come back to the point I was making earlier, if we don't do that, then the scale of mining required in order to deliver the outcomes that we're all looking for are not going to happen. And so it won't matter whether it's autonomous or not. There are certain functions that humans still need to perform. And so from our experience, as I say, it's not necessarily a net loss of jobs. It's actually a change in the skills required. And so, and more skills, more designed, there are higher levels of skills. And so we have more university graduates working for us now than we've ever had as a result, say, for instance. Because more broadly, and this is not a disparaging statement, but more broadly, those people involved in the truck operations, say for instance, were generally lower skilled people who participate in that space. Very well paid, don't get me wrong, so we pay our people well, but we are seeing an increase in the skill level in the workforce as AI takes a greater hold in the operations of our mines and brings the cost down over time.
And Sanjeev, if you could weigh in on that.
See, what the steel industry really requires for the transition is acceleration of the near zero technologies to come to the fore, which will help the transition. So I really don't think AI is going to help there. But what AI will surely do is what Jesse and Paul have mentioned, improve efficiencies. Steel is a process industry, and you put in different qualities of raw materials to bring out a standard desired steel product. To reduce this variability, AI helps. We've already started using AI in a big way to reduce this variability, which reduces energy consumption, which reduces the carbon dioxide emissions. So that surely it helps. The second big way in which AI helps us is to make the process autonomous. I used to look after safety as well. Steel is and mining, both are very hazardous industries. We run a few mines as well. We run a coal mine, we run iron ore mines also. So we do a lot of what Paul was actually speaking of. Trying to make operations remote, reduce variability again there, but therefore reduce emissions, make the processes more energy efficient. So this is how AI will impact the mining and metal industry.
Well, thank you guys. I believe that was a very interesting conversation and you provided great insight into your industry. Do you have any closing remarks for us?
No, I think in general, maybe go back to what I started with. We're very excited to hear about where the world is going, and I think a lot of people in this room are going to tell us exactly how this energy transition is going to occur. In the end, we will provide the materials that are necessary to enable that. But we should just be aware that these are long investment cycles, and there are large gaps in terms of bringing this online. And maybe to Paul's point, we need to be careful to keep what we have. And then what we will see is there will be gaps, and there will be a lot of price volatility in order to drive the investment that's needed to enable the energy transition to occur. But in the end, it will occur, and it can occur, and we can provide the materials that are necessary.
Paul.
Yeah, I think I'll just close on saying that my desire for a conversation like this, an important forum, I think as this is, I think there needs to be more of them, is we need to have a more clear-eyed discussion about the aspiration and the practical reality of delivering. And that is where I think the challenges lie for us. It's very easy, and policymakers can make statements about what we should and shouldn't be doing, but the practical delivery of those policies is very difficult. And as I mentioned before, it's not the fact that there's a lack of intent, I would have said, from everybody wanting to drive towards a lower emissions future. I don't think that's the case at all. People sort of bemoan the fact that progress hasn't been as fast as what we would like. But again, it is actually the practical realities that gets in the way here. And it's not because that's wrong. It's just that maybe it wasn't as well considered at the formulation of the policy and the timeline period as we would have liked. So from mine, I think a higher quality conversation about not just where we're going, but how to get there would be really important. So I'm sure today will be a good contribution to this conversation in this sense. And the last point I'd like to make is that I really focused on the younger generation in the room and here at the business school. Is that this area is very complex, as you're going to hear today, and I'm sure you know it already. And this area requires lots of intelligent, driven, smart minds to be devoted to the solutions that we require over time. So my pitch to everybody who's remotely interested in energy is that if you are motivated and interested in this space, then this transition requires all your effort, and your future is assured from a career perspective. I'm absolutely sure of that, because there's a paucity of people who are willing to take up this opportunity and drive it. And if we're going to meet those goals, then we're going to need a lot more people than the older folks here up on the stage doing it, I can say.
Speak for yourself.
Whatever I've heard, I resonate with most of what I've heard here. Just that the gap between aspiration and reality is really huge. The transition is required. The issue is existential for life as we know it on the planet. Not the planet per se, the planet will regenerate itself. It has seen 5 mass extinctions already. Scientists do believe that we are right now in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. And we don't quite realize that. The climate emergency is exacerbating this crisis. So we, as the people of this generation and the generation like ours, which is moving on, need to make some changes. A lot of innovation has happened in this part of the world, and Sean, as was speaking initially, a lot of these ideas need to be converted into action. The innovation, a lot of that innovation has happened in this part of the world. So the world will be looking at many of you, students sitting behind there, to bring in those technologies which will help and enable this transition. And from a steel standpoint, which is a hard-to-abate industry, a lot of other materials like cement and aluminum are hard to abate. We are looking for answers, and those answers are not easily available as of now, and time is running out.
All right, well, thank you guys. It was a great discussion. There we have it.